Hey guys, welcome back to One Shot Cophine. It's been 1,000 years, but I'm back for the moment. So today we're going to talk about Formation Processes by LadyZephyr. Before we begin though, I have a couple of disclaimers that are about 6 podcasts overdue, but better late than never, I suppose. So first of all, the stories discussed on this channel, blog, podcast, whatever, are typically mature rated, most always for sexual content between consenting adults of the same sex/gender. So if you're underage or if such content is illegal where you live, you've been warned and, turn back now or what have you. Also, though I try to tone it down for the podcast, I do use pretty foul language from time to time, so again, kind of a heads up for that. And lastly, since this review and future reviews, if any, are likely to be more analytical than past reviews, I feel it's worth mentioning that my views and opinions on elements of the story do not necessarily reflect the views or intentions of the authors. But that's all for the disclaimers. So, it's been a while since the last proper review, and roughly 6 months since I started the whole podcast deal. Quite a bit has changed since then. As of today, the podcasts have over 1,300 collective views on YouTube, and the One Shot Cophine Tumblr page just broke 300 followers like last week, I think. Considering I never really expected to get more than maybe 30 views when I first recorded the debut review for 032421 by JBear1701, those statistics are pretty rad to me. But that said, for those of you who've joined since then, or maybe tuning in for the first time, I feel like a bit of touching base is in order. So, briefly a bit about myself. Call me Kylan. As of the time this airs, I will be 23. I was in my final semester of nursing school when One Shot Cophine first started, and I have since graduated with my Associate of Applied Science in Nursing. Other than that, a wannabe fic writer, full-time urban stealth camper, aspiring vagabond, and a hopeless fanfic fanatic. My ships are Xena and Gabrielle, Vossman, and of course Cophine. That's pretty much everything in a nutshell. If you want to know anything else, my ask is always open, or my inbox, but I am the world's worst at replying to messages, so apologies in advance for that. So, how the podcast works is I'm going to talk for a minute about the author, give a summary about the fic itself, and then from there we're going to break the story down a bit and talk about particular literary elements and such that I enjoyed and why. And after that we'll finish up with my favorite moment in quotes, followed by submissions sent in via Tumblr. After much deliberation and viewer input, I've decided to keep the summary portion of the review for now, and the summary for this is going to be ridiculous, so I apologize in advance. But for anyone who wishes to skip to a certain point, there are timestamps included in the description, as well as a transcript located below the cut if you prefer to read through instead of listening to me ramble for the next half hour. But on that note, a bit about LadyZephyr. From AO3, Lady Z has 26 works. She writes predominantly for Orphan Black with 21 Cophine fics, which is an insane amount. But she has also written 3 Balm Girls fics and 2 Ruby fics. Her Cophine works consist of 5 OB Frankenfic collaborations, 3 one-shots, and 13 chaptered fics that range anywhere from 2 to 37 chapters in length. Guess which one is the 37 chapters fic? She boasts 2 fic series, the I Think Completed Between the Lines series, and the First Do No Harm series, which is still in progress. In fact, excluding the 5 OB Frankenfic collaborations, she's completed 17 of the 21 OB stories, with the 4 remaining fics being Easy, Ties That Bind, Cura to Ipsum, and In Time. The first 3 have actually been updated rather recently, within the last couple months. As far as fic type goes, her works have a propensity to be quite sex-centric, which, depending on the story, is a focus that can either be gratuitous, smut for smut's sake, or remarkably multifaceted. Whether it's fluff or angst, LadyZephyr is a master at evoking emotion in her works. The, trepidation can be especially vicious, in my opinion, which we really get a taste of in Formation Processes. No doubt due in part to her rather audacious writing style, but we'll get into that. So, I have a small LadyZephyr drabble. It's how I stumbled upon her works. And Mom, if you're listening to this, you should probably mute it for about 5 minutes and come back. So, I mentioned in the first podcast, way back when, that when I first joined a fandom, I refused to read AU works, because I, get this weird attitude where I think they're dumb, and I only read canon fic, and it's stupid, but, AU fics are amazing. So when I first joined the Cophine fandom, there are a lot more AUs than there seem to be canon fics, and I first stumbled across Kind of Always Late. I read their story Jouska and Data Collection, religiously, would just go back to those all the time. Also, the Here Take a Shot series by Tumbleweed. I would go through and read all the canon and headcanon chapters, and just skip the AU stuff entirely. And I just kind of bounced around between those 2 authors, and those handful of stories, and every now and then I would branch out and read a random story by some random author. Well, in my bouncing around, I kept seeing this name for people would use French in their fics, and so they would be thanking this person, LadyZephyr. And so very quickly I got the impression that LadyZephyr was like the go-to person in this fandom for French, but I didn't pay much attention to it. Well, when I was reading through the Here Take a Shot series, I come across chapter 24. It's titled Dirty Talk, and it's a headcanon chapter, and I assume all of you that make your way to this understand how the Here Take a Shot series works, because it's like famous. People send in prompts to Tumbleweed, sexual prompts, for things they want to see between Cophine and smut scenes and stuff. And the prompt for this chapter was fisting, and Tumbleweed mentioned in the author's notes at the beginning that they were kind of hesitant to write a fisting scene because they didn't think they could ever write one as good as LadyZephyr's in her story After Hours. And I don't know, it was late and I was curious. So I read the story, After Hours by LadyZephyr. And so that's how I made my way slowly to Lady Z. My impression of her very quickly evolved into, one, that she was like the go-to person for smut in the OB fandom, and two, that she was one of the, she hates it when I say this, I think, but I consider her one of the elite writers of the Cophine fandom, and this was before I paid attention to who OB Frankenfix was. Like, yes, Tumbleweed and Kind of Always Late are listed in that big section of writers for like the collaboration fics, and I would go through and pick their names out when I wanted to read their stories, but I didn't pay any attention to who OB Frankenfix was, or pretty much anybody else in that list, until after LadyZephyr. I tore through a lot of her stuff, and then I was like, oh, these people belong to a group. I should check out these other people too. So I began to consider the OB Frankenfix group like the elite writers of the Cophine fandom, but LadyZephyr was kind of my gateway into that. But that's my brief LadyZephyr travel. I was reading very dirty smut and stumbled across it. But her After Hours story is a part of the Between the Lines series, which kind of fills in the gaps between the scenes we see on screen of Cophine, just like what happens, you know, off screen. And it's really nice, so I do recommend you check it out, especially if you like canon fic. But on that note, I'm gonna quit rambling. So we're gonna talk about the story, and I'm gonna try and do this summary, guys. I made notes this time, so we're gonna see. It's gonna be really long, so I'm sorry. But anyway, so Formation Processes is a Cophine archaeology AU, and it's set initially in the summer of 1979. It's 37 chapters, and I think her longest fic, and a whopping 107,000 words. If you haven't seen that post on Tumblr floating around that shows you how that compares to like Harry Potter novels and stuff, I wish I had it saved because I would show you. That's a lot of work. That is a huge fic. So be prepared. You're in for a wild ride. I don't call it a behemoth of a fanfic for nothing. So again, this is an archaeology AU, and it takes place a few hours west of Rome in Italy in 1979. So to kind of set the scene, they are excavating an Etruscan burial site. So Cosima is Leaky's TA for the summer, and she's in charge of 8 other students, and they're part of the Berkeley team, and they're working together with the French team to excavate these sites, and it's an old world dig. So going into the first chapter, they head out to the site, they're doing their thing, and Leaky is suspiciously absent. He's late, and when he finally arrives, he's accompanied by Delphine, Dr. Villeneuve's master student. If you listen intently, you can hear the sound of LadyZephyr cringing at the way I just pronounced his name. But anyway, so Delphine is his master student who's going to be replacing him for the duration of the dig. And so Cosima and Delphine kind of share this moment where they see each other and suddenly feel like they've seen each other before, like they know each other. And Cosima is just instantly drawn to Delphine, so she goes and walks over to them, and they're introduced, and they think about how the other seems so impossibly familiar, though they've never met before. So they get on with the dig, and eventually a body is uncovered, and Leaky has this theory that it is a warrior king, and Cosima is so like pissed off that he just kind of assumes it's a male, and Delphine's job on the dig is to determine the sex of the burials because she is studying paleopathology. So after they unearth parts of this burial, this fractured skull, and Leaky goes on about his theories, everyone packs up for the day and they head back to camp. Delphine's still thinking about these weird feelings of familiarity she has for Cosima, and asks Cosima whether she's been on any other old world digs, to which Cosima replies no. They've never met before, and surely they would remember each other if they had. But anyway, so they go back to camp for dinner. Cosima introduces Delphine to the gang, and gets into it with Leaky over his warrior theory without any proof. But Delphine assures Cosima that she'll be unbiased. She's not going to let Leaky talk her into mislabeling anything for the sake of his unfounded ideas, I guess you could say. And then they kind of discuss Leaky's strange flirting with Delphine. And apparently he does that to pretty much all of his TAs except for Cosima because she's extremely feminist and, well, a raging homosexual, but that's not exactly clear yet to Delphine anyway. But then they begin discussing feminist ideas on the subject of that, and Delphine shares her Venus of Willendorf theory, and they bond over their archaeology intellect, and it's really adorable. Cosima eventually invites Delphine to go into Rome with them for the weekend before going to clean up, and Leaky calls Delphine into the lab tent to look over the artifacts from the dig that they collected for the day. And by the time she finally gets out of the tent, Cosima's already gone to bed, and she's not really interested in hanging out with anyone else, and so she heads on to sleep as well, where she has a very interesting dream where she's kissing Cosima in the back of a van. And when she wakes up, she's very confused by it, especially by the fact that she was quite aroused by the dream. And then so she's kind of confronted with the fact that she may potentially be attracted to Cosima, so she starts thinking about that. Then we also see that Cosima also dreamt of Delphine, but she doesn't really recall the specifics. So thanks to the dreams, things are a little bit uneasy between them on camp that morning, and eventually Cosima gets it out of Delphine that she had a weird dream, but she doesn't go into detail. And they head off to the burial, and they just continue to have a bit of lighthearted conversation. Delphine explains why she chose paleopathology. Leaky, being the douchebag that he is, eventually separates the two of them, probably because he's like catching on to the gay. And so they're separated to supervise different groups of students, and eventually they uncover 3 burials by the end of the day. One of the burials is a juvenile, and it's got a suture line that matches the previously unearthed quote-unquote warrior, and Leaky wanted to think that the warrior's suture line was a wound, and so that kind of blew his little theory out of the water, much to mine and Cosima's delight. Delphine explains that the suture may potentially be genetic, so perhaps a mother and child. So the discovery is a fascinating thing for everyone there, and one of the other students, Karen, starts talking about how her boyfriend doesn't quite get it and that he doesn't understand. Things like that are exciting to her, which prompts Delphine in turn to reveal that they never do get it and that she just broke up with her boyfriend again, which leaves Cosima feeling a little upset because yay, stray girls. Later that night, Delphine has another dream about Cosima, and they're making love again, but this time Delphine is in the body of a man, and like Cosima is Cosima, but she's in a different body. And again, Delphine wakes just very confused and very aroused. So when she gets up and joins camp, Leaky offers her a cigarette, and she happily takes it up, trying to get her mind off Cosima and these strange dreams. And while they're standing together talking, he propositions her about working in the States. And we find out that Delphine isn't really against considering sleeping with Leaky for like professional gains, but she knows Cosima wouldn't like it and kind of keeps that in mind. So back at the dig site, Delphine's sketching out and examining the burials when Cosima shows up to take pictures. And they discuss the burials, and then we find that Leaky's supposed warrior is actually a textbook female. And then after that, they finish up for the day, and the group of students all head back to camp, where they then head to Rome for a weekend of discos and adventuring. And they find a disco, and the two dance, and Delphine drinks a bit too much, rather. And she's almost assaulted by a considerably drunk man, but Cosima shows up and saves the day. And then the two head out to explore the city, but not before Delphine learns from Jamie and Karen that Cosima is homosexual, which means her strange dreams of making love to Cosima aren't entirely impossible. So Cosima and Delphine head off from the disco, and they grab a bite to eat, meant to sober Delphine up, but unfortunately she orders more wine. So Delphine is drunk as fuck. She's singing and rambling about men and their lack of understanding for her passions and about being alone, all the while switching back and forth between English and French, and it is adorable and hilarious. And she starts asking Cosima some personal questions, and they briefly discuss Cosima's attraction to women and kind of homosexuality in general. I really love this scene because it's a beautiful variation of the Cophine discussion of orientation in like season 1, episode 8. Well, after that, they return to the hotel to the sounds of Jamie getting it on in the next room over with a man named Luca, and it is hilarious at first both to Reed and to Cosima and Delphine, who are still insanely drunk and they can't stop laughing. But the situation quickly becomes tense as the nature of their conversations and Cosima's thoughts about Delphine turn rather sexual. Sober enough to know better, Cosima cuts the conversation short, suggesting they go to sleep. Before they have a chance to crash, however, Karen shows up, requesting to room with them since Jamie's hooking up and has booted her out of the room for the night. So Karen's arrival effectively shuts down the chance of any ill-advised Cophine action, but simultaneously it also forces them to sleep in very close proximity, because they all three squeeze into the bed, and Delphine is sandwiched in the middle because Karen didn't want to sleep anywhere near Cosima. As you can imagine, Delphine has another very brief dream, and this time it's just of making love to Cosima in bed. It's short and it's really disorienting, and when Delphine wakes up, she can't really tell if she's still in the dream, and she makes the mistake of kissing and running her tongue along a semi-conscious Cosima's shoulder. And Cosima leans into the touch, and Delphine is more than happy to continue until Cosima, in a moment of denial, decides Delphine must be asleep. And so she clambers out of bed without looking back and locks herself in the bathroom to kind of gather her thoughts. And Delphine eventually goes to check on her and apologize, but Cosima doesn't know what to say or do, so she just opts for a shower to avoid the situation a bit longer. And by the time she finishes and finds a rather upset-looking Delphine sitting on their bed, she tells Delphine it was okay, dismissing it as no big deal since Delphine was half asleep and couldn't possibly know what she was doing. And after that, Cosima sends Delphine to shower and tells Karen to take a hike and go back to her room, because she and Delphine are gonna head out and go get breakfast in a bit. Before leaving, they share a small moment where Delphine gets sick from her hangover, and Cosima kind of takes care of her a bit, holds her hair and all that sweet stuff, I guess. And so they spend the morning touring the city, and they grab a breakfast at a bakery, and eventually they make their way to the catacombs of St. Calixtus for a guided tour. So the piles of bones and mummified burials leave the two awestruck as they wander, hand in hand in the half-dark, a ways back from the rest of the group. They talk of the catacombs in Paris, of the world's oldest mummies originating in Peru, which is a key detail, remember that. And eventually Cosima caring for Delphine earlier that morning. And Delphine says she wishes to thank Cosima, and she leans in and presses a kiss to each cheek. But with their simmering attraction for one another hitting its boiling point at last, the closeness proves to be a bit too much for the both of them. And they both kind of close the distance without really knowing who started it, and share a pretty passionate kiss. But Cosima's senses quickly catch up to her. She swiftly pulls away, a bit bewildered, and she's like, Delphine, we gotta talk about this, we've gotta be more careful, but this isn't really the place to talk about it. It's not the time. So they exit the catacombs and go to grab lunch, and they tour more of the city, and a sort of unease is settled over the both of them, as you can imagine. And Delphine keeps trying to figure out what's going on in Cosima's head, but every time she tries to bring it up or discuss the kiss, she gets shut down. So it isn't until later that afternoon, when they get back to the hotel, that they're afforded any sort of privacy. But Cosima continues to just act strange. She won't really look at Delphine, and when Delphine leans in too close, she pushes her away, and eventually Delphine has enough of it. She doesn't take it for very long, and she does confront Cosima, who immediately shuts her down, but this time by kissing her. And then goes on to question Delphine about her sexual orientation. And Delphine admits to being just as confused as she is, and the two of them just resolve to talk about it later after Cosima takes a shower. But talking gets thrown out the window for a little while longer after Cosima gets out of the shower, because Delphine's gone to get some fruit, and so they enjoy it, and fruit slices always run into sexy times, I think. So they're munching on tangerines, I think it is, and then they wind up getting lost in each other, kissing more intensely than they ever have before. And Cosima's hands kind of begin to wander, and she gets the slightest taste of Delphine's bare skin before Delphine stops her. Cosima obliges, of course, reassuring her that they don't have to have sex, to which Delphine then replies that they can't really have sex because Cosima doesn't have the proper equipment, to which Cosima takes deep offense. They launch into another discussion, through which we learn a few key things. First of all, Delphine didn't like non-intercourse aspects of her previous relationships for particular reasons not really yet disclosed. Cosima's openness about her sexuality has basically destroyed her reputation, making it hard for her to advance her education and hold down jobs. 3, Delphine's reputation is also damaged, but for having an affair with her previous supervisor, and then taking the fall for all of it. And then lastly, it seems like Delphine has always been rather detached about sex, hence the whole not caring to use it for professional gains thing, while Cosima seems to be all about the intimacy of it, the giving, the receiving of pleasure. But after they talk, they go out again, they grab some gelato, sit in front of the Pantheon, and then fall into another discussion. And we gain a little bit more insight into Delphine's previous relationship through both the dialogue and introspection, the latter of which shedding light on the fact that Delphine isn't really as detached from sex as we previously thought, and that Remy's detachment and strange staring during foreplay is a huge part of why she is afraid to let Cosima touch her, and Remy's weird. And she starts to explain the whole staring thing to Cosima, but then changes her mind and offers that they go explore some more instead before grabbing a late dinner and heading back. The next morning finds the two in bed, each waking up from dreams of passion. And Delphine almost immediately pulls Cosima in for a kiss upon waking up, and at last she's feeling bold enough to let her hands explore Cosima's body. It seems like the two are well on their way to making love for the first time when Scott comes knocking abruptly at the frickin' door, informing them that they have like 10 minutes before they leave, so those plans are shot. So then we're back at camp. Delphine is almost immediately confronted by Leaky about her burial assessments, and then randomly asks her if she's on the pill, before telling her to be careful with Cosima. Kind of interesting, conflicting things there. Take birth control, beware of the lesbian. And he says he's only looking out for her career, but Delphine's kind of suspicious, rightfully so, because Leaky's a creep. The rest of the evening kind of fades away. The group chats around the campfire, and eventually Cosima and Delphine are left alone while everyone else goes to bed. And then they find themselves lip-locked around the fire, faced again with the reality that they may very well have sex, and her inexperience. Delphine becomes overwhelmed again and requests that they stop before they really even began, and goes to bed. Frustrated, Cosima retires to her tent, touches herself with Delphine's name on her lips as she comes, and wonders if the blonde would perhaps allow her to pleasure herself while they're together. But then she kind of realizes that she doesn't truly care if Delphine even touches her at all, and reluctantly admits that she's hardcore fallen in love with Delphine. And so Delphine also lies awake in her own tent, and she's burning and mulling over her own feelings for Cosima, and it becomes too much for her, sending her crawling back to Cosima's tent and into her sleeping bag. And they finally make love, each bringing each other to release in a scene that is equal parts sexy and tender, but the high of their consummation is short-lived when Delphine tells Cosima she loves her, and then the brunette refuses to admit that she loves her back, not wanting to make their eventual separation at the end of the dig hurt more than necessary. And after barely consoling Delphine, the two fall asleep in each other's arms. And the next day, Delphine spends hours lost in thought while working on site, thinking of the previous night, worrying over Cosima's supposed lack of feelings for her. She tries avoiding Cosima for the most part, and is just kind of casual in her presence, until eventually Cosima corners her after dinner and calls her out, which leads to kissing by the fire, which leads to them being discovered by Scott. But he swears that he won't tell, and Cosima warns that they need to be more careful. But despite that, they do continue to mess around by the fire for a while, before they eventually head back to Delphine's tent, where things go south. That's a bad pun. When Cosima tries to go down on Delphine, who's too afraid of feeling disconnected to really allow her to do so. They decide to sleep instead, and Delphine dreams of them again. Well, finally kind of wondering if these dreams could be of, like, their times together in past lives. She wakes Cosima and kind of wants to ask her opinion about that. And Cosima agrees that, you know, it's possible that they have past lives, but she also concedes that, holy shit, Delphine is crazy. And I just kind of cackle over that line every time I read it. So, after receiving news of noise complaints the next day by a particularly pissed off Leaky, they resolve to be more careful, restricting their encounters to, like, frustrated makeout sessions. But they only last about 2 days before what was supposed to be nothing more than innocent cuddling kind of evolves into Cosima taking Delphine over the edge. And we find out that Delphine has rented them a room in Antica for the weekend, time with which they spend exploring both the city and each other's bodies. And it's a particularly powerful scene that I really enjoy when they make love in the light for the first time, and Cosima finally gets to taste Delphine. The chapter ends on a really peaceful note, with Delphine telling Cosima she loves her as they both look out over, like, the Mediterranean Sea. And though Cosima doesn't say it back, she replies she knows, and I love that scene. But it's the calm before the storm, and they have no idea. So the weekend trip didn't sate anything, it only served to fuel their desires for each other. And with only a week left together on dig, they get rather reckless and desperate, and they make a very poor decision of sneaking back to camp during the middle of the day to have sex. Very loud, not at all sneaky sex. And they wind up busted by Leaky in an extremely terrifying and embarrassing fashion when he walks up on them. So Cosima is sent back to the dig, and Delphine is sent back to the lab tent. And when Cosima finally returns to camp that afternoon, she's heartbroken at the sight of Delphine's missing tent, and immediately just goes to bed. But in her sleeping bag, she finds a piece of paper, and on this piece of paper is an address in Paris, and the words Je t'aime, which is just a small detail that I really, really love. The next chapter brings us back to Delphine, who's meeting with her professor back in Paris, and we learn that she's not going to be removed from the master's program, and that her professor is a homosexual, hence the reason for his, like, understanding of the situation. He warns her to be careful and just to stay out of trouble and keep her grades up, basically. And it's a slap on the wrist, but it's a relief. So a few days later, Delphine wakes up to the sound of her intercom buzzing, and she thinks it's Remy, and she just kind of yells out the window for him to get lost, only to discover that it's Cosima and freaks out and lets her in. And so the two fill each other in on what transpired after their separation. But then Cosima reveals that she's only got a couple days before her flight back to the States. She's not there to stay. But so they kind of make the most of the time that they have, and they spend a weekend in a world of their own. You know, they shower together. Delphine tastes Cosima for the first time, you know, allows Cosima to photograph her nude, and Delphine forces her to tour Paris briefly. They drink wine, they eat truffles, and they finally take a bit of time to talk about themselves because they realize that they really don't know anything about each other. And it's beautiful, and it's terrible, and it's heartbreaking. And I cried again just going through and making notes for this chapter. But Cosima finally tells Delphine that she loves her back. And moments before Cosima boards her flight, Delphine convinces her to reveal her family name because she won't give up her address or her phone number or anything else so that they can stay in touch. But at least now, Delphine kind of has a teeny tiny glimmer of hope of finding Cosima someday. She'd never find her if her name was as common as mine. But anyway, they both cry, I cry, we're all crying, and it's just bittersweet, I guess. So the end of the chapter leaves us with a heartbroken Cosima. She's now home and being dragged off to party by Felix, off to forget about quote-unquote straight girl Delphine. And then in what is a heartbreaking change of chapter, we are greeted with a nice bold caption indicating that it is now May of 1985, 6 years later, when we see Delphine again. And she's now in San Francisco, and she's searching for a gallery that is to be showing art by a Cosima Niehaus. And she can only hope that it's the same woman, which of course it is. But the gallery is awash of homoerotic art at like every turn. And after she runs into Felix, who it's his art show, Delphine spies a photo of herself on the wall, naked from behind in her bedroom in Paris from 6 years previous. And in what may be the most chill-inducing scene of the entire story, Delphine is looking at the photo when Cosima's voice rings out behind her to comment on it, not recognizing Delphine from behind with her now short dark curls. And Delphine turns and is well received by Cosima, who is thrilled to see her after all this time. But all of Delphine's joy and all of my joy fades away when she catches sight of Cosima's wedding band. Fantasy shattered, she keeps her reunion brief before leaving the gallery, in a bit of a rush, you know, tears filling her eyes, as she makes the long walk home. And then from there, it's kind of down the rabbit hole we go. The next couple of chapters really begin to fill in some blanks. We learn the dirty details of Cosima's marriage, David's freaky cuckolding fetish, and the fact that she's not in love with him at all, leaving us with a huge question of why and how she willingly got herself into such a screwy arrangement anyway. Most importantly, we learn that she still has feelings for Delphine. And as for Delphine, we now know that she's been working postdoc in the States for several months and has just picked up a job teaching 2 summer courses at Berkeley after spending the past 8 months on the East Coast. And it's at Berkeley that the two meet again. Cosima's there to speak with her advisor about continuing with her PhD in the fall and decides to drop in on one of Delphine's lab sessions, thinking that it's a lecture. And they speak briefly in the hall. But Delphine's pretty cold with Cosima, with some very poorly disguised jealousy throughout the entire encounter, while all Cosima can think about is being with Delphine again, if only for the pleasure of her company. Upon finding out that Delphine will only be at Berkeley for 4 months, Cosima really kind of resolves to try and have some sort of relationship, since their time would only be temporary anyway, so she doesn't have to worry about like getting in over her head and her whole life turning upside down and things like that. So she decides to ask Delphine to dinner, and Delphine agrees, but not without kind of this like below the belt jab about David being there also. And Cosima, you know, catches on to this, and she's really distraught at Delphine's closed offness and her constant mentioning of her freaking marriage. And Cosima asks if they could just talk. But the scene ends and we don't really get an answer until the next chapter, after Cosima waits for Delphine outside of her office and asks her again. And they kind of argue, Cosima offering friendship if that's all Delphine wants, and then Delphine not wanting to accept because being around Cosima without being permitted to touch her or to love her would be absolute hell. And finally Delphine asks Cosima if her marriage is even real, the question we've all been asking ourselves. And the answer is a crushing yes, which I was so in denial. This story was so confusing to me the first time I read it. Like, I was so confused from, I don't know, like chapter 16 on till like maybe the last 2 chapters, because I was so deep in denial that Cosima was even married to David, that she was even having sex with David. Like, I refuse to accept it. And so it's like I would read about her doing all of these really weird things in support of his freaking fetish. And I'm like, that didn't happen. No, that didn't happen. And I also didn't know what a cuckolding fetish was. So I was really, really confused by that because I didn't like look it up or anything. That'd be a hell of a Google search anyway. But yeah, so I was really deep in denial. The story made a lot more sense the second time I read it when I had finally chilled out a bit. It wasn't the presentation, it was me. But anyway, so yes, her marriage is real, unfortunately. Delphine, hearing this, feels that she has no place for herself in Cosima's life. So Delphine dismisses her, pretty much telling her, she's made her choices, she's made her life. And Cosima just seems kind of pissed off and leaves. And Delphine's wondering, like, what she even has to be mad about. A month passes, during which Delphine is asked to stay on at Berkeley through April, and Cosima is off, still pining, and has actually registered to attend a conference in August that Delphine will be speaking at. So the two meet again at the conference in Denver, and it seems like the month apart has kind of allowed them both to cool off and reset. Cosima asks Delphine to dinner after her lecture, and knowing that she'll have to get used to being around Cosima if she's going to be teaching at Berkeley for the year, Delphine finally agrees, gifts out on a night of professional dining and networking and all that boring shit with Leaky for an evening with Cosima. So dinner is easy, and it's filled with discussions of Cosima's dissertation and Delphine's research, and they really connect. They speak briefly of their sexualities, of Cosima's marriage and Delphine's failed engagement. Delphine keeps the news of her extended stay to herself for the time being, while letting Cosima know that she's at least applied for a few other jobs in the States, and it's all kind of really misleading, so Cosima still thinks she's leaving very soon. And the scene ends with Cosima offering to show Delphine her photos after dinner, specifically the intimate shots taken in Paris all those years ago. So back in Cosima's hotel room, they pour over Cosima's collection of all these lesbian, homoerotic photographs, and they speak somewhat of their past relationships that had happened in the last 6 years. And then later, they order ice cream through room service, and the conversation turns soft, kind of unfiltered and heartfelt, as Cosima reveals that she never really stopped thinking about Delphine, and that she even went back to Europe 3 years prior, hoping to find her, but she chickened out, fearing that it was too late. Delphine kisses her then, but almost immediately she pulls back. She's unable and she's unwilling to be the other woman, and is completely unaware of the nature of Cosima and David's marriage, where Cosima is allowed and encouraged to cheat on him anyway. So after her initial panic settles, Cosima kind of coaxes Delphine to stay and just talk. And they do talk for a time, but eventually words kind of give way to silent caresses. They kind of build into more until both of them find themselves conflicted but kind of caving into the temptation of it all, and they make love for hours, and they trade confessions of love, and it's beautiful and it's hot and it's overwhelming for the both of them. They make it until morning before everything kind of comes crashing down, when Delphine makes the mistake of thinking that this night kind of marks a new beginning, while for Cosima it was kind of supposed to be the beginning of an end, and Cosima's in too deep already, so for her it has to end with Delphine's upcoming departure, because how else could she go on living this crazy ass life with David, knowing that a life with Delphine is just within reach. But of course, that idea is ruined when Delphine finally reveals that she'll be teaching at Berkeley for another year. Cosima effectively loses her shit at the news. Fear kind of manifesting as anger, and she accuses Delphine of lying to her outright and just throws her out. She won't hear a single word of it. And that's it for the conference. Back home, Cosima vents to Felix about it and admits that she's still in love with Delphine. And she wants to be with her, and that's the whole problem, isn't it? She wants it too much. But Delphine doesn't know this, and she kind of berates herself for not realizing that Cosima's agenda was different from her own. And she dreams of Cosima again often, but makes it a point to avoid her on campus. It works well for like 3 weeks, and then one day Cosima just kind of comes wandering into her office with this accusatory question, like that implied Delphine slept with Leaky to be able to cover his sabbatical. As you can imagine, this immediately leads to more just tired arguing, but it's immediately interrupted when Scott shows up brandishing a profusely bleeding cut. So Delphine drives them to the ER in David's car, while Scott gets stitches. The two talk for a while in the waiting room, and Delphine discovers David knows that Cosima is a lesbian, and wonders aloud why in the hell they ever got married at all. Cosima replies with a rather offensive comment about the French taking lovers, and Delphine storms out, leaving Cosima to take Scott home alone, before speeding home to an uncomfortable afternoon with the in-laws, who are very clueless as to the nature of her and David's relationship, evidently. So the next morning, Cosima has all she can take of quality time with her mother-in-law, and lies about having plans with Delphine so that she can get out of the house. She attempts to hang out with Felix, and then with Scott, but both of them are in the company of another, So she actually does end up seeking out Delphine on campus, and they go for coffee, and it goes perfectly for once. They finally talk somewhat about Casima's marriage, about her history with David, and the fact that she is allowed to take lovers. But Delphine just cannot be her mistress. She admits that that's not what she wants. She doesn't want to be the side chick, and so they decide to try friendship instead. And it works for a while. They enjoy like a month of grabbing coffee and sharing articles, but jealousy eventually does rear its head one afternoon when Delphine admits to having a date. And her second date, in fact, with a man named Mike. We soon learn that Scott had introduced them. Cosima is devastated by the news and just kind of at a loss. Not that she has any right to be, and she knows this, I think. Cosima goes home where she gives good old David Never Dave a bit of hell and then seems to be falling ill. So switching back to Delphine, we get a front row seat to her date with Mike, who actually seems to share Delphine's passion for fieldwork. He's scholarly just like she is, but even with the shared interest, there's still no spark. And when he takes her home and tries to make a move and go upstairs with her, she turns him down and ends up going to bed alone. So the next morning we see Delphine working in her office when Cosima shows up, pale and shivering, asking for Delphine to take her home. And Delphine takes her to the ER instead, where we learn from Cosima's triage that she had an abortion 6 years ago, a fact that they discuss later on when Delphine is taking care of Cosima, who has been diagnosed with an STD at her apartment. Things are simple and they're sweet, and they just kind of settle in and they drift off to sleep for the night. Of course, the morning brings new troubles when Delphine asks Cosima to leave David to be with her. And another bit of truth about Cosima's marriage is kind of revealed in response to that. In addition to social stability and freedom to do what she wants sexually, for the most part, David provides her financial stability, one that Cosima has never really had before. He pays for her schooling, her digs, the house, everything. And unlike Delphine, Cosima didn't have parents that she could depend on for money. They disowned her for her sexual orientation, and Cosima kind of rages about this for a bit, then eventually has Delphine take her home so she can call David and inform him of the fact that he probably has an STD. Felix is waiting for her at home, and mostly to tease her because, her disease is curable and his AIDS are not, so he has no sympathy. And then he relishes in the fact that David's going to be pissed when he gets home, 1 for the STD and 2 for the pot smoking in the bedroom, amongst other things. So after calling David, Cosima heads to bed, and then her dreams are filled with Delphine. So waking up to an empty house, Cosima calls Delphine in a desire for her company, but she's already made dinner plans with Mike, much to Cosima's displeasure. But dinner doesn't exactly go to plan when Delphine just admits to Mark that she's in love with Cosima and then bails on him to head over to Cosima's place unannounced. So they eat sushi and Delphine stays the night, and they just kind of sleep innocently in bed together and then make breakfast in the morning. And the entire ordeal just reeks of domesticity, and it is absolute bliss. And the week continues on in a similar fashion since David's still away on business and such, until one day Delphine just kind of starts acting strange, a bit cold, but she's got classes to teach, and so we don't really find out until later on in her office what's bothering her when she just asks Cosima to leave home and move in with her. Cosima asks her if it can wait and just asks if she'll take her home for now, and Delphine wants to say no but ends up saying yes. So they go back to Delphine's apartment and things get emotional and intimate really quickly, sexual tensions building steadily until Delphine, ever the queen of bad timing, reveals that she's leaving in May for a dig in Peru, which kind of further complicates their plans for being together and causes Cosima to leave with Delphine making no move to stop her. So things get shaky over the holidays after that event. Delphine is in France for Christmas, and Cosima is left to play housewife at a lovely waspy Christmas party and to entertain an increasingly mushy and concerned David. January can't come soon enough. The new year finds Cophine cooled off and kind of ready to face each other again as Cosima shows up at Delphine's apartment unannounced. Finally, they're able to discuss Cosima leaving David without everything going up in flames. And Lady Z makes perfect use of the this is my decision and not yours. There is no decision, you have one way forward, Cosima, and this is it. Bit of dialogue from season 2 in this exchange. Except this time, thankfully, Cosima understands and doesn't send Delphine off crying. They make love to each other again after way too long. I say that like there's not an insane amount of smut in every chapter, but you know what I mean. So Cosima goes home after a day or so and immediately brings up separating with David, who just like outright ignores her until Cosima shows like persistence in the suggestion. And the conversation gets nowhere, however, and Cosima ends up leaving to go photograph Felix and Sarah and Kira in the park. Like that night when she gets home, she receives a call from Delphine, who asks when they can be together, like openly together, to which Cosima replies now if she really wants to. Then they agree to go out to dinner the next day. Dinner goes well, but Delphine gets her first taste of life as a queer woman in a less than understanding world when a random passerby mutters dyke as they cross paths. And she finally realizes not caring what other people think may not really be as easy as she originally anticipated. Because she's always going on about how she doesn't care what people think and she's not worried about her reputation. But she's suddenly faced with this reality of, oh shit, can I handle this? You know, this is really going to be a thing. And I think it's a very good eye-opening moment for her. Back at Delphine's apartment after the fact, Cosima is again urged to divorce David, like ASAP. And she reveals that since he won't take her request for separation seriously, she's going to try and force his hand by acting a bit outrageous, starting with a very queer party at her house on Sunday. The party turns out to be like a full-blown pride fest, but things don't really bode well for Cophine at this party, because Cosima gets extremely lit and then practically takes advantage of Delphine before abandoning her in the bathroom. And then when the party winds down, she finds Delphine wasted, way too wasted to go home, so she puts her to bed in the guest room. And the next morning, Cosima fights with David over the party and Delphine and everything before he heads off to work. And then he just leaves Cosima and Delphine to their own devices, which includes breakfast and copious amounts of sex. And then to them getting busted when David walks in. You think they would have learned the first time with Leaky, but anyway, David walks in, shit hits the fan, as you all know. And then this moment at first seems to mark the beginning of the end, not only for Cosima and David, but potentially for Cosima and Delphine as well. Because as the chapter closes, we see Delphine asking Cosima for space, an unspecified amount of days later when Cosima stops by her office. And so Cosima agrees to give her space, and Delphine tells Cosima to take time and to work on herself too, and so she does. You know, she starts working on her dissertation again. She and David are in therapy, working towards their divorce. She gets her own apartment come like March. Even with Delphine not part of her life, things seem to be moving forward, but she knows she's got to get her back, and so she signs on for the dig in Peru, without Delphine's knowledge, mind you, until she just shows up. So she shows up at the dig, and they kind of agree to take things slow and to let things build between them a bit more naturally. They don't screw around on site, they wait until they get home, and then they finally get to start a real relationship. And then we see in the epilogue that they stay together, you know, they have kids, they eventually move into their dream house, and I could spend like another hour just summarizing the epilogue because I cried when I read it. I think it's most definitely one of like the top Cophine endings out there. It's just so touching, so sweet. It's so well written. Every teeny tiny detail in that epilogue is beautiful. It's the perfect ending, a well-deserved ending to the hell that they went through to get there, I think. And so they pretty much get there happily ever after. And I know I say I don't believe in happy endings, but I'm a sucker for this one. So, but on that note, that is the end of the story and the end of my obscenely long, rambling, overly detailed summary. So if you actually listen to that, I'm sorry, but thank you. So now I want to talk about particular elements of the story that I really enjoyed, and there was a very long list, but for the sake of time, I'm only going to talk about a few points. First and foremost, I've got to talk about the characterization in this fic, as always, because it's pretty much the foundation for the other points I want to make. So even back when I was still fairly choosy with my AU fic, I was so down for the idea of archaeology Cophine Though I didn't exactly go fact-checking, the whole story appears well-researched, and the archaeology speak feels so natural and well-versed that I honestly thought LadyZephyr had extensive background experience in the field, which, of course, she's not an archaeologist or anything, and if I'd read the chapter notes the first time where she mentions that, I wouldn't have spent half the book thinking she was. But needless to say, the conversion of Cophine's passion for science to a love of culture and prehistory is really seamless, and seeing them presented in that way so genuinely was truly delightful. Now, beyond her characterization of Cophine in ways that stay true to canon, such as Cosima's ever-flowing hands and fireball attitude, or Delphine's willingness to seek out Cosima against all odds, she does a remarkable job of character building in general. Cosima and Delphine are so well-rounded and complex, and dynamic in a way that is so true to life. We see them change so much over the course of the story as the years and the months go by, in both big and small ways. On a larger scale, we see things like Cosima getting married to a man, for example, despite her often expressed dislike for spunk and the like. Or even in just Delphine's change of appearance by cutting and changing the color of her hair. But more important than that are the minute changes we see. Changes that can take place as quickly as scene to scene, as we witness Delphine and Cosima's perspectives evolving and their relationship shift in regards to what they know about the other person at the time. And given the third-person omniscient narration of the story, we are treated to their thoughts and feelings along the way, and we get to experience the confliction they each feel when what they want clashes with the circumstance at the time. And anyway, the point is that LadyZephyr has given us two remarkably layered and complex individuals, and allowed us to really share this journey with them on such a uniquely intimate level. And that said, next I just want to touch on the historical element of this fic. Despite my love of xenofics, I've never really had an affinity for historical fiction until I entered this fandom and got swept away by the many 1900 AUs floating around AO3. I have such an admiration for it now, and I especially appreciate the awareness that LadyZephyr has when writing stories that take place in another time. The era always plays a key role in her historical fics, and she lets it color the dialogue, the actions, and the perspectives of her characters so appropriately. Obvious examples of this are the blatant discrimination Cosima has experienced in her life, being an openly queer woman during a time when it was still not even close to being widely accepted. Cosima and Delphine's feminist ideology is another example, one that I feel is an important and highly fitting element to their character makeup in general. And also, check out her work in progress ties that bind. You will see exactly what I'm talking about. She captures the mindset of the time period in which she writes in a way that is almost beyond words. I mean, it's riveting. But definitely check out Ties That Bind for another wonderful example of what I'm trying to talk about here. Okay, and so going back to at the beginning of this thing when I said LadyZephyr had a very audacious writing style, I've always described her writing as bold. She isn't afraid to make readers uncomfortable, which is something that I struggle sometimes with in my own writing, and I have a lot of respect for it. And I think a great example for this is Cosima's marriage with David. Nothing about that situation was easy to read, especially as the nature of their relationship slowly comes to light. It was disconcerting and at times a bit overwhelming. So much so that I had to put the fic down and wait a day and come back, and I'd never have that problem. But it was too much. But it was supposed to be. I mean, certainly LadyZephyr could have spared us the grueling details, left us without the oh-so-lovely mental image of David masturbating on a hotel room floor while Cosima's being taken by another larger man. But these unsettling details carried with them a new level of understanding in regards to Cosima's own experiences and state of mind, and allowed for us as readers to empathize more deeply than what would have been possible had LadyZephyr skirted on the details, choosing to play it safe rather than push us outside of our comfort zones. And also, kind of along the same lines of comfort zones and the way people typically write, especially in regards to sex scenes or smut, or just intimate moments in general. When people are being intimate in real life, there are awkward moments. Things aren't always passionate and sexy 100% of the time, and she doesn't shy away from that. And it really adds a new layer of reality to those scenes and engages the reader on a deeper level. And really, it's not just the awkward ones. There are moments of sadness within otherwise sexual scenes, especially in this fic, and, moments of silliness and joy, and she allows for all of it. Whatever the intention, she goes for it, and hits the mark every single time with an execution that is just worthy of praise. And that's, again, why I say that, yes, her smut can be gratuitous, but she knows how to write it in a way that is so intricate and complicated and so multifaceted, again. And it's not just smut for the sake of smut. It's really key to the plot of this story, especially as we see their relationship develop. It's kind of like in real life, how sometimes sex is just sex, but in other times it's so much more than that. It's a way of expressing how you feel about someone. Like when Cosima doesn't want to say that she loves Delphine, and she's like, can't you feel it, you know? She does an amazing job with it. I could go on about that for days too. But for the sake of time, we're going to move on. So I want to talk about my favorite moment and my favorite quote very briefly, and then we're going to get to the shout-outs. So, for my favorite moment, I'm going to pick something different than my first two original picks, just because people already mentioned them in the shout-outs that I received. You already know I'm full of sin, so my favorite moment is going to be when Delphine sneaks into Cosima's tent at the beginning of chapter 9, and they get it on for the first time. I'm not bold enough to read it, but specifically it's that moment when Delphine straddles Cosima after she's like shucked off her pajama pants, and Cosima can feel how aroused she is. It's just so sexy. Like, sorry, not sorry, but that scene does terrible things to me, especially at that moment. But as for my favorite quote, it's the lie to me scene dialogue in chapter 15 when they're making love and Delphine asks Cosima to lie to her, to tell her that she'll never leave her and doesn't want anyone else, which she does. And then Delphine tells her to say that she loves her, and Cosima so swiftly sobers in the moment and is like, Delphine, no, and then goes on to finally admit that she loves her back. That whole scene is heartbreaking. It's cleverly written. I've got chills again just thinking about it. Jesus. But anyway, okay, so I'm done with my rambling now. So my first shout out is actually on my phone, so I don't have a screenshot of it. But I suckered my friend Lindsay into reading formation processes for reasons I can't really say, but it's really funny. And she said that there is an authenticity to the writing that is quite enjoyable. As for the rest, via Tumblr, my first shout out is from Cophine Lovin'. And Cophine Lovin' says, Formation Processes is one of the first fics I read, and I recently reread it because it is so good. My favorite moment is when Cosima goes to find Delphine in Paris, and they are making love, and Delphine asks Cosima to lie to her, to tell her she loves her. It's so heartbreaking and perfect, and I still think about that moment. Overall, such a wonderful fic. See, that was one of my favorite moments. I'm so down with it. I think that's probably my second favorite moment, even though I made it my favorite quote because I cheated. But yes, I agree, Cophine Lovin', and thank you for submitting. My next submission is from Carinta Agogobel Unified. They said, hey, I'm currently in the middle of Formation Processes by LadyZephyr, aka Lady Canuck, and I'd just like to say that I love the degree of realism and depth with which the settings, and particularly the time periods, are rendered. It's very difficult to find any fic in a fandom that does that well. And yes, as I mentioned earlier, Lady Z kills the historical fic aspect of this. She is always so cognizant of cultural biases of the time and things of that nature, so I agree. Thank you, Carinta Agogobel Unified. And my last text shout out is from Screen Queen 71. So, Green Queen 71 says, I won't deny that Cosima owns my heart, and I tend to gravitate towards her in any fanfic, but I think what LadyZephyr does so incredibly well is capture Delphine's thoughts, feelings, and emotions. I am always immediately captured by this particular author's interpretations of Delphine. The scene where Delphine finds Cosima at the gallery in 1985 is a standout for me. I am excited and elated right along with Delphine when she hears Cosima's voice and steels herself to turn around and see her for the first time after all those years. And then when she sees the wedding ring, my heart is completely crushed in tandem. It's brutal, and it's one of the things LadyZephyr does best, depicting the gut-wrenching emotion that often befalls these two women. I love the spans of time in this work. I feel like it allows me to really live in the story, to take this journey alongside Cosima and Delphine. The epilogue is stunningly beautiful in its simplicity, filling in the gaps by way of Delphine pouring through the boxes of old pictures. This is hands down one of my favorite works, and it's one I revisit often. I would never in a million years be able to say that better myself. So thank you again, Screen Queen 71, for weighing in. Your commentary is always one of my favorites. And last but not least, I did receive a piece of fan art from the, I'm going to say it wrong again probably, but the amazing Satal C13. And I looked at this thing for days after I received it, and I love it. It's so clean cut and nice. So thank you for submitting it. A good choice of Evelyn Brochu photo, by the way. But that is all for my shout-outs. And then I also, of course, did some fan art. In addition to the background graphic, I have this little Formation Processes logo, and I cheated and already posted these on the One Shot Cophine Tumblr over the last month or so. so they're not really new. And I had a couple other pieces that were being worked on, and because I'm not really the best manip maker ever, they never got finished because it's really difficult. But I do have these two. So I have my little logo, which was actually made by accident, and for the sake of time, I'm not going to go into that. And then the last one is an edit of the Weekend in Paris photo that Delphine is looking at on the gallery wall whenever she is reunited with Cosima in 1985. It's got a bit of artistic license to it because, you know, Delphine shouldn't be facing the window and the bed should be behind her, but the photo was originally supposed to feature Cosima as well, and she was laying on the bed taking Delphine's photo, but it was really hard to find a picture of Tatiana that was going to work for that, so I kind of had to scrap that idea, and I went from there. So I'm trying really hard to be proud of this because I really like it, but hopefully you guys do too. But anyway, so that is going to be all for this podcast. I'm sorry that it took so long to make a new one, and I don't really know if I'm going to make another one after this. I haven't really decided yet. But thank you again to LadyZephyr for dealing with my rabbles and putting up with me on a daily basis, actually. And for all of your amazing fic, and for continuing to try and keep this fandom alive despite the difficulty and lack of inspiration these days. And thank you again to everyone who has tuned in. A special shout out, by the way, to my Poland listeners. You guys are like top ranking in my statistics. So thank you so much for listening to me ramble. I really do appreciate it. But anyway, that's all for now, so thanks guys.